Today I'd like to share with you a fun little project that you can do before next spring. That's making these cute little garden markers out of metal. For those of you that don't know what garden markers are, after you place a seed into the ground, you place this marker next to it so you know what kind of plant is currently growing in that spot. The first step of the process is to find yourself some garden clip art. Here's some of the art that we'll be using today. Once you know how tall the biggest vegetable you'll be making is, I take my sheet of steel and cut out a billet that size to make it more manageable while I'm working on this project. And the tool you currently see slicing through this metal like it's butter is called a plasma cutter. Cut out the clip art, then use a Sharpie pen to trace the pattern onto your steel. To try to minimize the amount of wasted steel you're going to have, while tracing, place your patterns as close as possible to each other. Okay, it looks like we're ready to break out the plasma cutter again. Before we do that, we need to take a look at something. The tip of your plasma cutter has what's called consumables. Since we're going to be doing some very fine cutting, we want to inspect the tip. This is the tip I've been using for quite a while. You can see how large and uneven the hole has become. It still works fine for projects that just involve raw cutting power, like when we cut out our billet, but it will not work when you're trying to make fine, detailed cuts. So we want to replace this tip with a new one. That's why they're called consumables. And while we're changing out parts, this is the electrode that's in your cutting wand. If it looks like this, it's had a hard life. So let's replace that with a new one as well. Now that we have new consumables in our plasma cutter, let's get started. The first thing we want to start cutting is all the stuff that's on the inside of your markers. You know, things like your eyebrows and your mouth and the nose and stuff like that. Now we can go back and make our outside cuts on our markers. When you're all done, hopefully you'll have a big pile of vegetables. And unfortunately, a big pile of scrap metal. Make sure you send this to the recycler so they can melt it down and make a new sheet of steel for your next project. Now that they're cut out, we're going to have to deal with a small problem. If you'll notice along the edge where you cut, you're going to see slag. This is where the molten metal from your cut cooled it down and hardened again. The easiest way to deal with this on parts this small, use a flap disc. It's effectively heavy sandpaper for metal. Let's take a look. There we have it, a couple piles of clean vegetables. Now that our vegetables are complete, it's time to cut our steaks. We'll be using a 1/4-inch round metal rod. And this is what it looks like when you use a cutoff wheel. As it turns out, this is actually a pretty labor-intensive process. Let's see if I can find an alternate method. There you go, bolt cutters. The proper pair of bolt cutters will go through 1/4-inch steel with no problem whatsoever, and it's fast. I pre-marked this rod every 6 inches so I know where to cut. All you need is a helper to move the rod forward each time you cut. Okay, time to break out the welder. Clamp your parts into place. When you're welding, start out on the thick steel rod, get your heat built up, and then just drag it down onto your metal vegetable. Hopefully your weld will look something like this. However, when you turn it over and look at it, we had an awful lot of heat on that 1/4-inch steel rod. So the backside of your thin steel vegetable may look like this, but don't worry, we have a fix. Remember that flap disc we used before? It only takes a very little amount of touch-up to clean this up. With all the metal work done, it's time to paint. We want to start out by providing a primer coat on the entire project. Don't forget to flip them over and do both sides. I chose to paint the steaks black, but if you wanted to blend in more, you could probably do brown or green. You can see here it's quite possible to paint an awful lot of projects all at the same time. Just need to get creative with your newspaper. And yes, you're right, we really like carrots. In the late summer and fall, we plant our last crop. When winter comes, the temperature drops and they stop growing. So that way they don't become woody. And the later in the winter we harvest them, the sweeter they taste. So our house has fresh carrots all winter long. After you get your base coat of paint put on, get out your paint brushes and touch them up in any creative way you feel like doing. And because these are made out of steel, they'll last practically forever. Well, thanks for watching.